Good day. A virtual summit took place at the UN Security Council on Friday, May 7th, 2021. It is an interesting meeting, firstly because it was convened by China, which is now has now taken up the position of rotating chair of the UN Security Council and is therefore in charge of the agenda, and also because it gives a good example of China and Russia coordinating foreign policy positions on the UN Security Council, as they do increasingly in other places, as part of their joint partnership, their strategic partnership, which they have forged with each other. As the Chinese and the Russians now quietly admit, they are de facto allies in all but name, and on the UN Security Council, that is becoming increasingly obvious, and it is partly in order to highlight that fact that I'm going to discuss this meeting. But this meeting is not only interesting because of what it shows about Chinese-Russian cooperation in the diplomatic and foreign policy sphere, it's also interesting because it highlights a key ideological difference about the direction of world politics that is now taking place between the United States and its allies on the one hand, and between the Chinese and Russians on the other. This is this conflict between what is referred to by the Western powers as the rules-based international order, and the more conventional and, if you like, old-fashioned principle of international law, which is relied upon by the Chinese and the Russians. Now, the point to understand about this difference between the rule-based order that we hear so much about in the West and international law is that though they look like they are the same thing, they are clearly not the same thing. At the most basic, international law is a creature of consent between all countries, and it has its foundation document in the UN Charter and in the decisions of the United Nations Security Council and in the General Assembly. There is also a large body of court decisions, some of which extend back into the 19th century, which have also shaped international law. International law is generally administered through courts, of which the most important is the International Court of Justice in The Hague. It is also, in the case of treaties, sometimes, though not always, administered by national courts. So, for example, if Britain engages another country in a treaty, that treaty is then generally converted by the British Parliament into a law, and that law, a domestic law, and that law can be enforced in the British courts. So we have a complex body of law created through legal mechanisms, the UN Charter, the resolutions of the UN Security Council, the various international treaties, various international and national court decisions, and they all taken together in aggregate make up the body of international law. By contrast, the rules-based international order is a very different thing, and it's in fact somewhat difficult at times to define exactly what it is. Its primary advocates, who are to be found in the United States and Britain, often talk about it as if it is the same thing as international law, but it is striking that when they refer to it, they avoid using international law as a term to describe it. Always and invariably nowadays, we hear references instead to the rules-based international order. It's not clear where this body of rules comes from. Some of it is quarried from various international documents, like the UN Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but it's quite clear that it is considered that it is more extensive than that, and that it is also somewhat amorphous. I'm going to say what I think the fundamental difference between these two concepts is. I've touched on it in previous videos, but in my opinion, the difference between law and rules is that law is something which is clearly binding on its creators and which has universal and equal application. By contrast, rules are imposed by the maker, who is often not actually subject to these rules. I'm going to give you the analogy of what happens in a school classroom. A teacher is able to impose certain rules that are binding on the children in the class. The teacher, of course, is not subject to those rules. That is a system of rules imposed by the teacher. It is effective on the children, the school children, but not on the teacher herself. By contrast, international law, or law in this case, in relation to a school, binds the teacher, the parents of the children to some extent themselves, the school administration, and of course the minister who enacts and promulgates the law. All of them are bound by the larger vehicle, which is education law and which exists on any state. The whole concept of law, the fundamental principle that underpins law, is that the maker of the law is also subject to it, and the law constrains his actions. Any system of law which purports to exclude responsibility for the maker and does not constrain the maker's own actions or hold the maker accountable is not law. It is anti-law. It may be called rules, but it is absolutely not law in any accepted concept of the word. Now, that is a critical point, and of course it is one that Western leaders and Western commentators and increasingly Western jurists seek to avoid discussing, and which is the topic of some confusion. And I would say deliberate confusion. The US government and the British government and other Western governments do not want to come forward and say straightforwardly and openly that they consider themselves to be beyond and above law, and that their actions should not be subject to the same law that binds everyone else. So they pretend that the rules-based international order that they talk so much about is somehow the same as international law. However, as I have said, they are extremely careful to avoid using the term international law. They increasingly use these words in rules-based international law as a substitute. And given that those words are not a substitute for international law, that, to my mind, gives the whole game away. What the United States and its allies are seeking to do is to place themselves in the position of the teacher in the classroom, imposing rules on the children, but those rules obviously not applicable to themselves, and with themselves in no sense to be held accountable under them. So, what does this all have to do with the meeting that took place on Friday, 7th May 2021 in the UN Security Council? Well, the answer is that it was all about that, because the Chinese decided that they would convened this first meeting of their time as chair of the Security Council in order to discuss what they refer to as multilateralism and the importance of multilateralism in international relations. Now, multilateralism is, of course, already for the United States and its allies a loaded word. They don't openly reject it, but of course everybody knows that it is code for saying that the unipolar moment, that period after the Cold War, when the United States appeared to be at the absolute peak and center of the international system, able and in a position to impose its ideas on everybody else, has passed, and that is a good thing. Multilateralism implies concerted action by many states, or indeed by all states. It is, in fact, the negation of what used to be called unipolarity, the system where the United States decided the rules and made all the important decisions. So, what actually happened at the UN Security Council on that day? I say at the UN Security Council, though it's important to say that because of the pandemic restrictions, this was a virtual meeting. Well, I will say first of all that we do not have, unfortunately, a complete readout of Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi's statement to the Security Council, or at least not in English. The Chinese Foreign Ministry is extremely slow and slack in providing such readouts. But we do have a fairly detailed account of the meeting, or at least of Wang Yi's statements from the Xinhua news agency, which is China's official news agency. And here are some of the things he said, at least as Xinhua reports them. Wang put forward 4 propositions for all parties to practice true multilateralism. Note again the word true multilateralism. That in effect says that there are some people who conduct false multilateralism. In other words, multilateralism in ways only. And amongst these 4 rules, we have the first. All countries should conduct dialogue and cooperation on the basis of equality and mutual respect. No country should expect others to lose, but should strive to win together with other countries to achieve universal security and common prosperity. All parties should seek fairness and justice, not bullying. And then I think we come to the most important section. Or the core is to promote the democratization of international relations so that all countries share the responsibility for governance and jointly promote peaceful development. The key is to promote the rule of law in international relations, abide by universally recognized international laws, and mutually agreed international agreements. Note the careful references here to the rule of law and to universally recognized international laws. And then we have the switch. And this is, again, I'm taking this from Wang Yi's comments as reported by Xinhua. International rules are not the patents and privileges of a few countries. They should be abided by all countries without exceptionalism and double standards. So, in effect, what Wang Yi is saying here is that there is international law, which must be strictly abided by and which is binding on all countries, and there are international rules which are only meaningful if they are founded upon international law. Those rules, so-called, which purport to be the patents and privileges of a few countries, are contrary to international law. One has to unpack it a little, but the meaning is completely clear. Anyway, that's what Xinhua says that Wang Yi said. And then we had the response from US Secretary of State Antony Blinken. Now, Blinken's words are extremely interesting because in them he makes a sustained attempt again to create the impression to the casual reader that international law and the rules-based international order are one and the same. And I noticed, by the way, that the readout of his words provided by the UN Secretariat, the United Nations Secretariat, actually has him referring at places to international law. But in fact, when you go to the actual transcript of his words, published by the US State Department, you discover the very interesting thing, which is that there is no actual use of the words international law anywhere in Blinken's comments. He consistently avoids using them. And one has to ask oneself, why? Well, even if he doesn't use the words international law, he is extremely careful to talk about the rules-based international order. And he does so at great length and in many places. And we can cite a few examples. We will continue to push back forcefully when we see countries undermine the international order and pretend that rules we've all agreed to exist don't exist, or simply violate them at will. Because for the system to deliver, all countries must abide by it and put in the work for its success. Let me be clear. The United States is not seeking to uphold this rules-based order to keep other nations down. The international order we helped build and defended has enabled the rise of some of our fierce competitors. Our aim is simply to defend, uphold, and revitalize that order. Well, he doesn't refer to international law. He does, of course, talk, as I've said, about the rules-based order, but he does, in fact, refer at one place to something else, which is international humanitarian law. Now, international humanitarian law does certainly exist, but it must be made very clear that it is not the same as international law. It is only a part of it. And here I find what is, for me, the most disturbing aspect of Blinken's entire comments, because it is quite clear that Blinken and the United States are seeking to weaponize international humanitarian law, human rights law, if you will, as a tool that they seek to use against other countries. So we have comments like this: human rights and dignity must stay at the core of the international order. The foundational unit of the United Nations, from the first sentence of the Charter, is not just the nation state, it is also the human being. Some argue that what governments do within their own borders is their own business, and that human rights are subjective values that vary from one society to another. But the Universal Declaration of Human Rights begins with the word universal because our nations are agreed that certain rights to which every person everywhere is entitled. Asserting domestic jurisdiction doesn't give any state a blank check to enslave, torture, disappear, ethnically cleanse their people, or violate their human rights in any other way. Now, before I discuss that, I have to point out quite what that means. In effect, what Blinken is saying is that international human rights law, humanitarian law, as he calls it, somehow entitles some states to interfere in the internal affairs of other states. And it's striking which how he justifies that, because he talks about in domestic jurisdiction giving no state a blank check to enslave, torture, disappear, ethnically cleanse people, or violate their human rights in any way. Now, one might ask, what exactly is Blinken talking about? Because, as we know, especially following the announcement of the war on terror, but as it takes place to a great extent now around the world, the United States has done many of the things we see and hear about. Maybe it hasn't exactly enslaved people, but it certainly tortured them. The enhanced interrogation techniques that took place during the war on terror are now generally recognized by jurists, including the courts in the United States, as having been torture. The United States continues to disappear people. That is what extraordinary rendition is. It continues to ethnically cleanse people. Well, people in, say, Croatia, who were driven out of Croatia during the wars that took place there, at a time when the Croat government was allied to the United States, well, they could argue that they were ethnically cleansed. And violation of human rights is something which takes place in many countries, but the United States has also been a participant in some of those things. In fact, and this is perhaps one of the more comical elements of this speech by Blinken, is that he admits the fact. He says, I know that some of our actions in recent years have undermined the rule-based order and led others to question whether we are still committed to it. Rather than take our words for it, we ask the world to judge our commitment by our actions. In other words, all that we've done before really doesn't matter, because from now on we're going to abide by all our commitments to observe human rights. So that's all right then, that's fine. Look at what we're going to do, don't ask about what we've done. I think most countries around the world would find that impossibly self-serving, but I would add that it is very typical of the United States. It always says that people should forget about its previous actions and concentrate only on its future actions, which in effect means they should place total credence on what it says. Anyway, there we are. It's all about the international rules-based order, the rules-based international order. That is what Blinken is defending. Wang talks about international law. Blinken doesn't refer to it. It is the rules-based international order which, via the mechanism of humanitarian law, entitles certain countries, the United States and its allies specifically, to interfere in the internal affairs of other countries, and which, by the way, also gives them a blank check to interfere in the internal affairs, and not just internal affairs, but in the internal affairs and foreign policies of all countries. It is what justifies the whole system of the rules-based international law order which the United States is talking about. Non-interference, the principle of non-interference in internal affairs, the principle of state sovereignty, things which underpin the entire system of international relations and the entire system of international law, are in effect abolished because humanitarian law, international humanitarian law, supposedly trumps them, and it is the United States and its allies which are in a position to enforce this rules-based order on the basis of humanitarian law, because even though they have violated humanitarian law in the past, they give a promise that they won't do so in future. Well, as I said, an extraordinarily self-serving point of view. And of course, directly after Blinken's comments, it came up against the most forceful and strong-minded enforcer, if you like, of international law, who is none other than Russian Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov. And I think, by the way, that this ordering of speakers, first Wang talking about the importance of all countries observing the rule of law and international law, then allowing Blinken to set out his position, and then having Lavrov respond forcefully to Blinken's words, I think that was entirely intentional and carefully prepared by the Chinese and the Russians. In fact, I have absolutely no doubt that this is so. And whereas Wang Yi is careful to use careful and diplomatic language, Lavrov, in typical style, goes for the jugular. And here are some of the things we see him say. We believe efforts to impose totalitarianism in global affairs to be unacceptable, yet we see it more and more from our Western colleagues, above all the United States, the European Union and other allies, who reject all principles of democracy and multilateralism on the global stage. It is striking that Western leaders, while openly undermining international law, do not hesitate to argue that the main task of world politics should be to counter the attempts of Russia and China to change the rule-based order. Such statements were made the other day following the G7 ministerial meeting in London. In other words, there has already been a substitution of concepts. The West is no longer concerned with the norms of international law and now requires everyone to follow its rules and observe its order. What's more, US representatives freely admit that the United States and Great Britain have had the biggest hand in shaping these rules. So, there it is. The Chinese and the Russians stand for international law, the whole system of international relations, underpinned by law, founded upon the UN Charter, international treaties, concepts of state sovereignty, concepts of treaties upon treaties, built up over centuries, whereas the United States and its Western allies, and specifically the two core states, the United States and Britain, are seeking to substitute for international law a new concept of the rules-based international order, which supposedly entitles them to meddle in the internal affairs of all other countries and to conduct, in effect, policies around the world that ultimately contradict international law. This, it seems to me, is now the great division, the conceptual division in the modern world. Now, this was a Security Council meeting in which the two great power blocs, the United States and its allies, and the Russians and the Chinese, were able to state their own views. But I will say straight away and from the outset that this is a purely rhetorical meeting. Nothing was decided there. There was no vote of any kind and no meaningful decisions were made. Well, I'm going to say straight away that this concept of the rules-based international order that the US and the British are so keen on promoting is a phantom. It will never succeed because it goes against the fundamental interests of far too many countries. Even a country like India will not accept a system where the United States and Britain, because of their supposedly superior position as arbiters of international humanitarian law, are able to disregard the rest of international law and impose their opinions on everyone else. The Indians would say, for example, and rightly so, that that is impossibly self-serving, and they will undoubtedly also point out to the total hypocrisy that underpins this whole argument, a situation where the United States and Britain say that, whatever we did in the past, it really doesn't matter. We are still somehow the best people, and we are the people to make decisions when humanitarian law is being violated and when it is not. This kind of approach to international relations is simply not a viable one. When the Biden-Harris administration talks in this way, I think countries around the world, not just the Russians and the Chinese, are going to say to themselves, ultimately we have to take measures to protect ourselves from the United States and its allies, which are the greatest threat to us. There has recently been an opinion poll or survey of opinion around the world, which shows that most people around the world apparently believe that it is the United States which is the greatest threat to democracy, not China or Russia. These fantastic, inflated theories that the Americans and the British are indulging in, which supposedly give them the right to interfere in the internal affairs of all countries everywhere as arbiters of what human rights are. That explains why people around the world are starting to perceive the United States specifically in that way. Besides, the United States simply lacks nowadays the power to impose these concepts on countries like China and Russia. Already those two countries are too powerful for the United States to be able to impose its ideas in that sort of way. But unfortunately, Blinken's words show that the United States, and indeed the British, remain committed to these incredibly dangerous concepts. And whilst they do, there will be, it must be said straightforwardly, growing international tension around the world as countries around the world, but most importantly, the China and Russia, take steps to defend themselves, relying upon international law and the strength of their own societies and their own economies. Thank you for joining me for this program, a rather theoretical, perhaps juristic discussion of this important topic. I look forward to you joining me in future discussions on future programs on this channel. Please also check out our main channel, the Duran, where I do discussions of various topics of international relations with my colleague and friend, Alex Christoforou. Please also check us out on our new platforms, Odyssey, SuperTube, and Locals. You'll find links under this video. Please also support us to the extent that you feel able through Patreon, PayPal, and Subscribestar. And also check out our Discourse server. And remember to go to our shop and see the wonderful things we have there. Our famous magic mugs, our t-shirts, our hats, our hoodies, and all the rest. Thank you very much for joining me on this program for this rather abstract, discussing these rather abstract, but in my opinion, important issues. I look forward to you joining me in future programs and have a wonderful day until then.